Hello, BookTube, and welcome to your Daily Penguin. This is our tour through my Penguin Classic wall, and we are taking the penguins as we find them. No unifying theme so far. We haven't had that in a while. We bounced all over creation, and today we are fetching up on a big one. Well, occasionally we do big books, not in terms of length, but in terms of the shadow they cast on posterity. And this is certainly one of those. I don't think you'd be hard-pressed to find a book other than the Bible that's had this great an effect on so many aspects of human society. And that is, of course, taking us to 1859. This is The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. This is a great Penguin volume with introduction and notes by William Bynum. Just terrific, but you really don't need it. You really don't. In order to read and enjoy the book is actually very well written, very enjoyably written. And in order to enjoy that, you don't need any introduction at all. Darwin's prose is completely perfect. It's completely pellucid, so you don't need anyone to tell you what any of it means. You don't need an annotated edition, which is going to make a little bit of this video seem a little bit funny. What you need to do is be familiar with this book. You absolutely do need to be familiar with this book because it defines your world in a way that is given to almost nothing else on my Penguin Classic shelf or anybody else's Penguin Classic shelf, because this book was a bombshell when it appeared. When it appeared in a world in which 90%, 95%, 99% of intelligent, educated people in the West and in the East, but we'll just concentrate on Darwin's world, considered that the world had been created some discrete period of time ago by a god in its present form. And that even if it had been created sometime in the much more distant past, or in ways that we don't know about, at least we know that it was created and that there was a creator. And this book upends all of that completely. In this book, Darwin lays out an idea that living organisms follow a principle of evolution by means of natural selection. In other words, the breeding populations will select for future generations the qualities and attributes that will help them in their struggle to reproduce, in their struggle to leave descendants, biological descendants, behind in the next generation. So if your environment is slowly becoming an estuary, then gradually, over a huge amount of time, the better swimmers will live longer than the non-good swimmers, and because they live longer, their genes will be better represented in the next generation, and the generation after that. The generation after that will need even better swimmers. In very little time, the really good swimmers the evolution will select for the ones that have webs between their fingers, because it makes swimming even easier and gives more access to greater stores of food, greater access to safety from predators, greater adaptability to the biome that is changing underneath you, so that in 50 generations, 100 generations, the people, the individuals that have resulted from all of that natural selection will bear very little resemblance to the individuals that started the whole ball rolling, and won't be able to interbreed with them, will be in effect different species. It won't ever be the case, as anti-science creation denialists say today, that at some point a cat gives birth to a lizard. It won't ever be that. As has been pointed out many times before, the evolution is a process that happens to populations, not to individuals. It happens to populations, breeding to genetic populations over large amounts of time. And that is sketched out in Darwin's book, even though he didn't know what genetics were himself, and he didn't know anything about DNA, and he only barely knew anything about the paleontological record. It was only just beginning to be found when he was writing this book. It didn't matter, because Darwin had observed the natural world and thought about it long enough and been nudged by another discoverer to realize that none of those things matter, that this is a good argumentative theory to put forward, that it explains a lot more than any other theory without being vulnerable to being knocked down. In other words, if this were going to be knocked down, it would have been knocked down by subsequent scientific discoveries, mainly two. The fossil record, which only barely existed in Darwin's day, and which he himself said would be the thing that would totally blow apart his theory if it didn't turn out to support that theory. And what couldn't have been known to Darwin in his day, DNA analysis, which experts on DNA analysis have said would support Darwin's theory even if there were no fossil record. It's kind of amazing that we have a fossil record at all, considering that this world is teeming with wildlife that eats carrion down to the last bit. And also that this is a geologically, climatologically, and seismically unstable world. Earthquakes, tremors, mudslides, landslides, all the time. Lava flows, volcanic eruptions, floods, all the time happen. The surface of this planet is actually fairly inimical to the long and patient process of forming fossils. It's kind of amazing that we have any. And yet we have baseball stadiums full of fossils, every conceivable kind, going back to the billions of years when nothing lived on this planet that was macroscopic. Where for billions of years, all life on this planet was microscopic. The world was still teeming with life, but you wouldn't have seen it. If you'd been macroscopic and come to look for it, you wouldn't have seen it. Scum. It was a planet of scum, and then single-cell organisms. Millions and millions and millions, hundreds of millions, billions of years, without anything like life as we recognize it today in the macro scale. And even if we had none of that, even if we had none of the fossil record that started to develop in Darwin's day and has since grown so enormously detailed, genetic analysis would already prove that this theory is largely true. Darwin's theory has taken hammer blows left and right for 150 years and has survived them all. It is as close to a fact as anything in science can be, outside of maybe relativity. And that makes this book worth reading even if it were dry and dusty, even if it were, for instance, Sir Charles Lyell. His book on gradual geology was partially an inspiration for some of Darwin's thinking about this book, but Lyell is not all that interesting to read, certainly nowhere near as interesting as Darwin to read. Keep in mind, Darwin had a popular writing success with The Voyage of the Beagle before this book, so he knew how to write for a general audience, and it shows in this book. It's actually a very good reading experience, but it's far more fundamental. It would be fundamental for you to read this even if it weren't, because you only have to think about the system that Darwin is outlining in this book, the origin of species, the evolution by means of natural selection. You only have to think about it for a minute to realize that not only does it say that all of the infinite varieties of life that we see all around us in the world do not need a God to create them, but that they never did. That all you need on a living planet is replicating biological material. Cells that replicate. Cells that develop a wall and maybe an RNA fuel center inside them. Cells that start to prey on other cells. All you need is that. All you need is a living thing that can, in any minimal way, respond to the stimuli of its environment, and that is going to reproduce, that is going to divide, reproduce, replicate itself somehow. All you need is that. And the forces of natural selection will work on them anyway. Darwin's central contention is that all living things want to be represented in the next generation. They want to live. They want their cellular inheritance to live. That's what Richard Dawkins meant by the selfish gene. The genes want to reproduce. They want to be represented in the next generation. It doesn't have to be a conscious thing. And once you realize that gods are out of the picture. There's nothing that is individually, specifically, miraculously created. Nothing. Everything comes about by extremely long-term, minute changes in things that came before it. Until you get all the way back to abiogenesis. Until you get all the way back to the question of where those original self-replicating molecules came from. Where you originally get that, what you would call life. Where things are alive, where they're maintaining some sort of homeostasis apart from their environment, where they're starting to eat, where they're starting to prey and maybe in a way reproduce or divide and reproduce, something like that. And science doesn't really know where that original template came from billions of years ago on this planet, where life originally started to do that. And I have even heard some science-denying creationalists say, well, there you go then. You don't know where that comes from, so that was God. And maybe seed the rest of it. And I never know what to say to such people. You're telling me the entire pantheon of Hinduism is crammed into that one little moment, that they all got together to make sure that a cell reproduced? No. That was never part of your original mythology. That was never part of your understanding of the world. Your understanding of the world was always that your gods created everything. And that they created it largely as it is today. And that obviously isn't true. anymore. It amazes me. In the aftermath of this book, the fossil record, which clearly shows uninterrupted the evolutionary sequence of animals like whales or horses or humans, and also genetics, the science of genetics, of understanding the cell and genetic inheritance, how you can look at the cells of an animal and determine the layers that those cells were built on, using technology that was unknown to Darwin. It's always amazed me that in the onslaught of those three things, this book and those two disciplines, how religions as etiological explanations, as systems that are trying to explain the world to anybody in a factual basis, exist at all. I understand perfectly well how they exist as structures of faith. Lots of humans like that faith. They need it in their life. They firmly believe it makes them better people. It gives them a great source of solace and comfort in hard times. It gives them a source of moral direction. I understand why organized religions would live into the present day if in that light. But a lot of organized religions live in the present day in that light and also want to live in an etiological light. They want to live in a light where they not only give you moral guidance and support, but also explain the world around you. And religion has no explanatory power of the world around you. None at all. None whatsoever. The explanatory power for the world around you was finally and peremptorily removed from religion's hands by this book. Because this book presented a means by which the world around you in all of its complexity could exist and thrive and change without any divine involvement at all. And when the time this book came out in 1859, that's all it did, was present that viewpoint. But in the century since, that viewpoint has been supported by science. And no other viewpoint has been. So the fact that here in my own country, the United States of America, fundamentalist religions can, all throughout the American South, can be claiming that the world was created out of nothing by a god 6,000 years ago, and that every animal was created just as they are, boggles my mind. It just boggles my mind. You have to pretend, if you believe that whole established branches of science, established on proof, on reproducible experiments, on reproducible biochemical results, you have to pretend that all of that simply doesn't exist. You have to pretend that God created giraffes the way they look now. We know for a fact that that is not true. There is no point in the giraffe's genetic history in which any change to that genome was introduced out of nothing. No point at all. It's all known. Between the science of genetics and the science of paleontology, it's all known. There's nothing left. There are no big gaps that are left in the evolution and development of giraffes or elephants with their long trunks, or bumblebees with their elaborate communication, or bats with their flight and their sonar location. None of those are questions anymore. And when they were questions, religion was there to answer them. The gods created them this way. We know that isn't true anymore. And yet there are religions all over the world that still purport not only to explain your moral realm, which religions can still do, but to explain your physical realm. I have to review these books, practically one a day, and I'm always amazed at the simple, basic things I need to point out to their authors. Where the author, the self-same author, is willing to admit that humans have been able to radically change the nature and shape of dogs and pigs and cattle, birds, flowers, vegetables, enormously changed them over the course of a relative eye blink in the history of time by means of manipulating genetics. But with the closest that a fundamentalist, science-denying religious person will come to granting that is to turn the tables on you and say, well, then what you're saying is that the only way you can change those things is if someone does it, if someone intentionally changes them. So you're, in fact, supporting the idea of a god or gods who step in and do that changing. But no, no, we can see evolution like that, evolutionary population changes like that happening in real time. It doesn't require someone to do it. What that example is showing you is that those mechanisms can be co-opted by someone, not that those mechanisms are the only way that can happen. And all of that is instigated by this book. All those conversations, all those debates are all instigated by this book. So this is as close to required reading as you can have in the modern era to know where it all comes from. Because it wasn't it wasn't completely discrete. It wasn't a bolt from the blue, like I mentioned. There was a predecessor who came up with this idea before Darwin made this book. And there was Sir Charles Lyell and a few other people who came up with the idea of incremental gradualism, where the world has been changing very, very slowly. At the heart of that idea, although none of them pushed it that far, but at the heart of the idea of incremental gradualism is that that might be all you need, and that there would be no dramatic ex nihilo creation of anything. None of them actually pushed it that far, but this book does. And so in a way, this book really does come like a bolt out of the blue, where you can honestly talk about the world before the origin of species and the world after it. And therefore, since it's a book, instead of an atom bomb or an invasion or a plague, it really behooves book people to read this thing. So that's your Penguin Classic for today. This is, of course, a recommend. It would be, like I said, it would be a recommend anyway for how fundamentally important it is, but fortunately, it's also a fairly good reading experience. The only thing I want to add to your Penguin Classic is a slight Penguin adjacent recommend, which is an annotated edition. Now, I said the Origin of Species doesn't require one, and it doesn't. You can read it, understand it, and enjoy it without any annotation at all. But if you don't feel that way, quite a few of you don't trust me when I say things like that. I've had emails from a whole bunch of you over the years saying, well, you might understand it, but what about me? And I say, no, that's not true. Anybody can understand it without any annotation held in your hands at all. But if you feel that way, if you definitely want an introduction and annotation notes all the way along, there is a great edition, and it's this one. It's the annotated Origin, with annotations by, you can't make that out at all. Look at that, it's just gone completely. There we go. James Costa is the annotator, and this has the classic annotated style, where you have the text and then annotations clarifying everything as you go along, all throughout the Origin of Species, and this is terrific. As far as an annotated version of this book goes, this is terrific. So I wanted to make sure that you knew about that. I've mentioned it on this channel before, but it might have been years or thousands of videos. So just so you know, you don't have to go this alone. You can, but you don't have to. So there you go. That is your Penguin for today. Didn't expect it. Didn't see it coming. I'm intentionally not foraging ahead on these videos so that I don't make an extra tedious reading list out of them. But we have The Origin of Species, Charles Darwin. We've done a read-along on The Origin of Species on this channel. And even so, I've read it many times. You should read it many times. It is a fundamentally important book in human history. So it's a strong recommend for a number of reasons. And who knows? I don't think we'll have anything as portentous tomorrow. But we'll reconvene then and find out. Thank you, BookTube.